Go on the evidence and apply your mind fairly and dispassionately. That's the right approach. If you do that, I think we'll come to some changes in this bill. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a real pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Bromley and Chislehurst, the Chairman of the SAC Committee, upon which I also sit. And I must say I agreed with very much of what he said, particularly in respect of Part 3 of the bill, and also some of the weaknesses of Part 1 of the bill. I'm going to, Madam Deputy Speaker, begin with Part 2 of the bill. I suppose people would expect me to do that, given that it's about the independent public advocate, and that's something that I've been campaigning on and have had views about for very many years in this House. Can I welcome again the new Secretary of State to his place, despite the fact that sometimes having a whirlwind of appointments and 8 Justice Secretaries in 8 years does leave certain potential issues with continuity and making sure that things happen in a sensible way, apart from the differences in approach and personality that one might come across. I do know that he cares about this particular issue. He responded, I think, to the debate, made a reference to it in his own remarks, which was a backbench business debate that I managed to secure following the final collapse of the Hillsborough criminal trials, which is some time ago now. And there has been no reason since then, apart from perhaps turbulence in the government, I say gently, but there's been no real reason since then. That final collapse of the criminal trials was the last impediment to dealing with the recommendations in Bishop James Jones's 2017 report, The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power, in which he was asked and came up with recommendations to learn the lessons of Hillsborough. Now, he was asked and commissioned to do that by the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Lady for Maidenhead, who I'm very pleased to say I commend for the work and effort that she has put in over the years when she has had responsibility to dealing with the aftermath of Hillsborough. And she has developed a real understanding of some of these issues. And the Secretary of State, I know, will be talking to various predecessors and people who have done his job and others that relate to it. And he could do a lot worse than sit down with the Right Honourable Lady. I'm not trying to organise his diary or hers, which would probably be more difficult. But I do think that she has a real insight from his side of the House into some of these issues. And I do recommend, if he gets the chance, that he does sit down with her. Now, when he replied to that debate after the collapse of the last of the criminal trials arising out of the circumstances of Hillsborough, which is over 18 months ago now, he did promise, upon being asked by me, that the response to Bishop James's 2017 report he hoped to get out by last Christmas. Now, that has slipped for various reasons. The latest we've been told by ministers on the floor of the House is that it will be published in its full glory by this spring. I just say to him, we're nearly into summer, yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we still haven't seen sight nor sound of the response. There are, I know, because one reads the government's response to the Select Committee's report into coroners, many of the recommendations in that report made by the Justice Select Committee we were told would be dealt with in the overarching response to Bishop James's report into the lessons to be learned from Hillsborough. So there are some outstanding recommendations at which we had, as a Select Committee, I think I'd call it a straight-bat response from the government, that perhaps also can be dealt with when that report is completed. Now, can I say at the very beginning, I welcome very much the government's intent to legislate and the fact that Part 2 is in the bill. I would have preferred a standalone bill, but that's neither here nor there. The fact that there are clauses in the bill that relate to establishing an independent public advocate is very much to be welcomed, because better late than never. And the whole purpose of the independent public advocate is not to just add a further stage into what families, or further hoop for families to jump through, or a further stage that families need to go through at the beginning of these processes. It is to stop the aftermath of public disasters going so badly wrong as Hillsborough has. It cannot be right that over 34 years after that disaster happened, and we all remember it was televised, there are hours and hours and hours of film of that disaster. It wasn't as if it happened in secret and what had really gone on had to be winkled out. It was televised live at the time. And for it to have taken such a long period of time for those families to have properly acknowledged what happened to their loved ones, for the very many thousands of traumatised survivors who witnessed that horror, not just from Liverpool, because there were two teams playing in that semi-final, and for that to have gone on for so long with any controversy at all about what happened, when Lord Justice Taylor, within 3 months of the original disaster, set out in his interim report, substantially correctly, although not totally correctly, but substantially correctly, the full causes and reasons, shows just how badly things can go wrong in public disasters when there are interested parties who are trying to deflect the blame. When there are state organisations, whether it be the police in this instance and others, who are trying to make sure that their reputation isn't trashed by their responsibility being pinned on them, and who are then willing to do anything, use any amount of resource in order to blame somebody else because that is what happened, then it is no surprise that things can go badly awry. Now, one could just say, well, Hillsborough was a terrible example. The circumstances, and it was, but the circumstances of every disaster are different, but there are common elements. And one of the common elements is that where state-funded organisations, arms of the state, are involved, they appear to think that their reputation matters more than the truth. They appear to think that any amount of budget that they have over the years can and ought to be used to defend that reputation. And they often appear to think that it's perfectly all right to blame the victims, to blame others, to blame anybody but themselves. That is what we have got to stop. Now, I will give way on that point.
My honourable friend has been amazing campaigning on this, but does she agree that one of the commonalities with Hillsborough, with Orgreave and with child sexual exploitation in Rotherham was South Yorkshire Police? So when these patterns are formed, the government needs to do something to step in.
Well, she's correct about in what she says, and if there isn't accountability for what goes wrong, especially where there is venality, which there was at Orgreave and which was shown again at Hillsborough by that organisation, the South Yorkshire Police, where that does happen, if there is no accountability, if there is no reckoning, it's not going to correct that kind of behaviour. And I think one of the values of making sure that the aftermath of disasters don't go so terribly wrong is that one can keep organisations which may be tempted to behave in this way on the straight and narrow. I remember after the King's Cross fire, there was the person who was responsible for London Regional Transport, who was found to be responsible for the cover-up that happened there, was sacked. That then makes a big difference to the way in which the organisations involved actually deal with the aftermath of these things. Now, the whole purpose, and I say this to the Secretary of State, of having an independent public advocate is to try and make sure that in the aftermath of such disasters, they don't go wrong. And the way in which my bill, which I'm glad to see that he has reread, because I know we will have read it before, the way in which the bill that I've been introducing into this House since 2016 and has been introduced into the House of Lords by my friend, the Noble Lord Wills, the way in which that does it is to use what worked with Hillsborough finally, and that was a Hillsborough independent panel, a non-legal process, because almost all the legal processes and cases failed, to use that in order to shine a light on the light of transparency on what actually happened, to stop cover-ups. Now imagine if the cover-up at Hillsborough could have been stopped from the beginning, we wouldn't be 34 years down the line trying to untangle all of the intervening processes. The Hillsborough Independent Panel wouldn't have had to look at millions of documents. It could have looked at far fewer if it had been doing its work within 2 or 3 years, say. And any organisation that was seeking to use its powers and its people to organise cover-ups would know that the light of transparency, the rock was going to be lifted up, a torch was going to be shone upon what was under it, and they would not get away with the kind of cover-ups that were openly organised by South Yorkshire Police after Hillsborough in order to subvert the findings of the public inquiry. The interim report of Taylor clearly blamed the police. It clearly made remarks about the way in which the police had behaved and said that they shouldn't have behaved like that. The police then set about simply using the inquests to change the impression of it, and didn't they succeed in that? And every legal process since then did not work, right until the Hillsborough Independent Panel, over 20 years later, 23 years later, was able to get a full acceptance of the truth by close examination of documents. Now, if we could have, in the aftermath of disasters, the power to do that effectively at an early stage, it would save millions of pounds in things going wrong for years and budgets being used and diverted into looking at legal proceedings on whatever the disaster is. And we see some of the same things happening. Grenfell has already been going on for too long without a proper understanding of precisely what happened and who was to blame and what went wrong. The Manchester Arena bombing, I have constituents who lost a child in the Manchester Arena bombing too. Even with the inquest and the inquiry put together to run concurrently, it's still been over 5 years. So these things can extend for many years. There will unfortunately be more disasters in future because although one can try and minimise the occurrence of disasters, disasters are by their nature events that go wrong in combination in a way that means that terrible things happen. But if we have a way to stop the aftermath of them going as wrong as some of the current disasters that we've seen over the years have gone wrong, then we will be doing a real service, not only to the victims and survivors of those disasters, who've got quite enough to be dealing with the loss of their loved ones, but also we will save a lot of money in the end for the state. The investigations into Hillsborough over the years have cost millions upon millions upon millions of pounds. The budget of any public advocate would be a lot lower than that. And if they were able to stop things going wrong, we would be doing ourselves a favour. So I say to him, I value very much the fact that provisions are now published and that he's intent upon legislating. But there are two main things about the government proposals that I think will mean it won't work, as certainly as my bill intends. And that is, the current proposals deny agency to bereaved families in calling the advocate into action. Now, one of the things that anybody bereaved in a public disaster will tell you is, from being an ordinary family out of the public limelight, suddenly something happens, and at the time at which they are having to cope with the grief of losing a loved one, suddenly the spotlight of the entire nation is upon them and their family, and they're grieving, trying to grieve at the same time. Things are done to them. Things are set up out with their own capacity to arrange them. The inquest, to which they're often not parties, they certainly don't get legal aid. The inquiry, to which perhaps they might get representation, but not necessarily. And things all happen around them at the same time as they are in a fog of grief and wondering what's going on. They feel powerless. They feel done to. They don't feel they have any capacity to influence or be a part of what's happening, or to speak any kind of truth to any kind of power. Often feel like a spare part, third parties, not involved, but they're the most deeply involved because they're the people who have lost the most. So giving agency to the families collectively of a disaster to decide that the advocate should be involved, rather than saying, oh, and here's another thing we're going to do for you and give to you, whether you want it or not, and you won't have any part in deciding, I think is tremendously important. So my bill does that. His current proposals do not. But there's also got to be a power, not just to be a signposter. And I don't object to the provisions in the bill that enable the advocate to help and signpost and do these kinds of things for bereaved families. That can be helpful. But it can't only be that. Because I know that the Hillsborough families had people trying to signpost them to things. And it didn't work with what was going on at that time in respect to that particular disaster. The point of the proposals in my bill, and they're not currently in the government bill, are to enable that person to have to establish a Hillsborough panel type arrangement in order to guarantee transparency, to make sure that the advocate therefore is a data controller and can have the documentation that they need. It should be an awful lot less than the Hillsborough Independent Panel had to collect, because as much time will not have passed, and because one would expect this to be done at an earlier stage in the aftermath of any disaster. So I think that if amendments could be accepted that would enable the advocate to be a data controller and to have the power to establish an independent panel, to give the families agency in order to decide themselves that they wanted an involvement from the public advocate, then I think that would give the capacity to this provision to enable it to do what I want it to do, which is to stop disasters going so disastrously wrong, the aftermath of them going so wrong for bereaved families. Because in my experience of these things, and I've dealt with a number of these kinds of issues in my constituency over the now 26 years that I've been a member of this House, I feel old enough, then I think that if we were able to do that, we could stop things going wrong, and we wouldn't therefore have any of these instances where 25 years later, 34 years later, we are still in this chamber discussing what went on in 1989 at Hillsborough. We shouldn't be having to do it by now. Those families should have peace, but they still don't have it. If we can stop this kind of thing happening to other families caught up through no fault of their own in disasters that they didn't want to be caught up in, that have resulted in bereavement and pain, then I believe very strongly that we would have done the whole country a service. It will help a small number of people. It will not cost that much. It will save a lot of public money over time. But the provisions as currently drafted won't be effective enough to do that. Now, I hope, and I've always tried to, and I see the Right Honourable Gentleman for South Swindon in his place, who I also had meetings with over time about these provisions, and who's very helpful. I hope that the Secretary of State will have an open mind in respect of this, and will think that we are all on the same side in respect of this. We want something effective done. What we don't want is to add something into some kind of processing that isn't going to make things better enough, and that we would miss an opportunity to make things better than they currently are. Now, I don't care who legislates for this. If there's a Labour government, I'll be nagging them as much as I've been discussing it with ministers on the government side. I've met an awful lot of them over the last few years, and many of them are in the chamber now, in fact. And I hope that between all of us, we can just take this forward, because it's a cheap way of making sure that we save a lot of public money over time. It will help the families of those needlessly and through no fault of their own caught up in public disasters in the future, and we hope that there'll be a small number, but we know that disasters happen. It will really help them. For the Hillsborough families, it will provide them with a comfort in the knowing that the experience that they have gone through, the horrendous experience over 34 plus years that they have gone through, will not have to be suffered by anybody else who happens to be unlucky enough to get caught up in a public disaster. So now is our chance to do this. But please, Secretary of State, do not defend every word of the current drafting. Have a more open mind about what we can achieve in respect of this than we currently see in the drafting. I think there is a real opportunity across party here for us to make a difference to a small number of people, but that will make a big, big difference to the lives of those who've got enough to deal with when their family gets caught up in a disaster and they lose somebody. We can really make a difference here, and I hope that he will be open-minded to doing so. I'm perfectly happy to talk to him and the Honourable Gentleman for Charnwood about how best